Although we might think that DNA evidence is always accurate and reliable, it definitely has its limitations in forensic investigations. As new technology and software is developed, it has made the issue of DNA transfer more complicated for forensic scientists. Each new tool is more sensitive than the last, but with this enhanced sensitivity comes the need for a greater understanding of how and why DNA can undergo secondary and even tertiary transfer. The case of Lukis Anderson is a great example of these weaknesses, and why it's important not to rely on just one single piece of evidence and to always investigate further and gather additional corroborating evidence. Late in the evening of the 29th of November 2012, 66-year-old Raveesh Kumra, known as Ravi, was watching TV in his 7,000 square foot Monte Sereno home in California, while his estranged wife Harinder Kumra was asleep upstairs. Suddenly, Ravi was ambushed by multiple intruders who tied him up, blindfolded him, and gagged him with tape. They then went upstairs where they proceeded to hit Harinder before tying her up and leaving her next to Ravi. For over 2 hours, the thieves rummaged through the mansion, searching for valuables to steal, at the same time that Ravi was slowly suffocating from the duct tape they had placed over his eyes, nose and mouth. When the intruders eventually left, Harinder crawled into the kitchen and was able to call 911. Unfortunately, when paramedics arrived, they pronounced Ravi dead. An autopsy would later conclude that he had died from suffocation. As crime scene technicians processed the home, it began to appear as though the intruders had been somewhat forensically aware. They had worn latex gloves while committing the burglary, and a pile of them were left in the kitchen sink covered in soap and water. The majority of tests performed on the gloves only revealed DNA profiles consistent with Ravi and Harinder. However, further testing of the other items of evidence eventually revealed a mixture of 3 different DNA profiles. When these were run through the state database, there were 3 separate matches to felons from the Bay Area. 22-year-old D'Angelo Austin's DNA was found on the duct tape. 21-year-old Javier Garcia's DNA was found on the gloves, and 26-year-old Lukis Anderson's DNA had been found on the fingernail clippings of the victim that had been taken at autopsy. Within a few weeks of these results, Sergeant Erin Lunsford, who was in charge of the investigation, had compiled substantial evidence that implicated both Austin and Garcia in the murder, including their cell phone records that showed pings near Monte Sereno on the night of the murder. Detectives found it harder to link Lukis Anderson to the crime though, but a felony residential burglary on his criminal record and a parole violation were enough to keep them investigating. Eventually, they were able to find a loose connection between Lukis Anderson and one of the main suspects, D'Angelo Austin. A year before the murder, Austin's friend had shared a prison cell with Anderson. This friend and Austin had travelled to the San Jose area 2 days before the murder, stopping off in Lukis Anderson's known neighbourhood. Police suspected that Austin and his friend brought Anderson into the plan to break into Ravi Kumra's home because he was born and raised in the area and knew it well. For the police, this connection was enough, and he was soon arrested on suspicion of murder. At just 26 years old, Lukis Anderson was living a troubled life. He was homeless and spent his days begging for change in the downtown area of San Jose. He regularly drank alcohol to excess, and so, when he was arrested and faced with the DNA evidence, he was confused about the accusations made against him. Anderson told his public defender, Kelly Kulik, "I drink a lot, maybe I did do it," fearing that he had blacked out and had no memory of committing the crime. Due to the death penalty being a potential outcome for her client, Kelly Kulik had requested all medical records relating to Lukis Anderson. and that's when she struck gold. On the 29th of November, the same day that Ravi was killed, Lukis Anderson had as solid of an alibi as you can get. Kulik retraced her client's day and eventually found that Anderson was seen sitting in front of a store at around 8:15 p.m. and was obviously intoxicated. A few hours later, seemingly even more drunk than before, he wandered into the store and collapsed in an aisle, forcing the clerk to call for help. A paramedic with the fire department that attended the scene knew Lukis Anderson's date of birth by memory because of how often he encountered him, and they were able to admit him into the Valley Medical Center at 10:45 p.m, where he remained under supervision for the rest of the night detoxing. The Santa Clara District Attorney's Office reviewed the case and were unable to uncover any errors, contamination, or improper use of tools at the forensic lab that had tested the evidence. So how could Lukis Anderson's DNA have gotten under the fingernails of someone he did not know? DNA transfer is definitely more common than most people believe. Research has found that the average person can shed upwards of 50 million skin cells a day, making it possible to leave traces of your DNA almost anywhere you go. A study published in 2013 specifically looked at direct and indirect transfer of DNA between people and objects. The researchers repeated this with multiple different groups, but essentially they had 3 volunteers sit in a sterilised room and share a jug of juice, and after 20 minutes of chatting, the researchers re-entered and swabbed the volunteers' hands, the chairs, the table, the jug, and the cups in order to test for genetic material. Unsurprisingly, since each volunteer touched the jug at least once, each of their DNA was found on the handle of the jug. Despite not having any physical contact with one another, 1/3 of the volunteers were found to have another volunteer's DNA on their palm. But most interestingly of all, the researchers detected foreign DNA, profiles that didn't match any of the volunteers, on roughly half of the chairs and cups, and all over the volunteers' hands and the table. This means that the volunteers had unwittingly brought unknown DNA into the room with them. This could have been someone who handed them their morning coffee or who brushed past them while they were on the train. And this demonstrates just how easy it can be for DNA to be transferred between people, places, and objects. For Lukis Anderson, the solid alibi evidence discovered by his public defender saved him from being prosecuted for a crime he did not commit. It demonstrated how detectives had used confirmation bias by searching for evidence that implicated Anderson only after the DNA tests had confirmed a match. Thankfully, they did agree that Lukis Anderson was in no way involved in the disturbing home invasion turned murder, and they dropped the charges against him. For the other 2 men who were implicated in the murder of Raveesh Kumra, they eventually went to trial and were found guilty, along with a female, Katrina Fritz, who happened to be a prostitute that Ravi often brought to his home. She was found to be the one who had shared information about the layout of the mansion and the valuables that would be inside. Not long after the charges were dropped, Detective Lunsford was reading through Lukis Anderson's medical records when he had a sudden realisation. The paramedics who had helped Lukis Anderson on the night of the 29th of November were the same paramedics who, 3 hours later, had responded to the Kumra mansion. The prosecutors, defence attorney, and police all agreed that somehow the paramedics had been the ones to unknowingly transfer Lukis Anderson's DNA to the Kumra crime scene. While it may never be known for certain, there is a possibility that the pulse oximeter that is used to check a patient's vitals was responsible for the transfer, despite there already being policies that required paramedics to sanitize their equipment and the ambulances. Thankfully, in this case, the right people ended up in prison.